Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On August 14, 2016, at 8:40 a.m., CCTV cameras at the Nagasaki port terminal captured two young women eagerly discussing their upcoming trip. Betty Anderson, 25, and her best friend, Donna Wise, 26, looked like ordinary tourists in search of adventure. Their backpacks contained professional photography equipment, and they clutched tickets for the morning Black Diamond ferry. Their destination was Hashima Island, better known as Gunkanjima, an abandoned concrete labyrinth 9 miles off the coast of Japan that had attracted stalkers and history buffs for years. According to Coast Guard protocol, the ship departed from the pier at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. None of the crew or passengers had any idea that this trip would prove fatal for two American women. When, at 4:30 p.m., the ferry captain began the mandatory roll call before returning to the mainland, two names on the list went unanswered. Betty and Donna disappeared without a trace among the ruins of the dead city, leaving no trace except for the last shots near the famous Stairway to Hell. What looked like an accident in a dangerous area would later turn out to be one of the most terrifying secrets that the ghost island had hidden in its flooded basements for 3 long years. On August 14, 2016, the heat at the Nagasaki port terminal reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and humid, saturated with the smell of salt and diesel fuel. In the crowd of tourists milling around the ticket office, two young American women, Betty Anderson and Donna Wise, looked better prepared for the rough journey than the others. 25-year-old Betty and her friend, who was a year older, were dressed in light but covered clothing, and they carried bulky tactical backpacks on their shoulders. This was not a spontaneous excursion. According to records later found in Donna's cloud storage, the girls had been planning this trip for over 6 months. At 9:15 a.m., the Black Diamond ferry departed from the pier, heading for Hashima Island, known worldwide as Gunkanjima. There were 143 passengers and 6 crew members on board. Surveillance cameras on the deck captured the friends checking their equipment. Their arsenal included 2 professional Sony Alpha cameras, a set of interchangeable lenses, powerful flashlights, and 6 extra batteries. They weren't there for souvenir photos. Their goal was the so-called Block 65, a gloomy 9-story building that was once a dormitory for miners and now stood in the center of the emergency zone, where access was strictly prohibited. They arrived on the island at 10:40 a.m. The concrete massif of Gunkanjima towered over the sea, surrounded by a high protective wall. The group of tourists was led along a specially equipped route, a path fenced off with metal railings far from the dangerous buildings. The guide, a 60-year-old man with a loudspeaker, talked about the history of coal mining, but Betty and Donna stayed behind the crowd. A reconstruction of events based on fragmentary accounts from other tourists indicates that the decisive moment came at 11:20 a.m. The group stopped at the ruins of an old school to take pictures. While the guide pointed to the dilapidated facade, the girls slipped unnoticed under the rusty chain blocking the way to the legendary Stairway to Hell, a long, steep climb leading deep into the residential quarters. None of the cameras on the tourist trail recorded their return. They disappeared into the concrete maze. The situation became critical at 4:30 p.m. when the ferry was preparing for its return trip. The captain of the ship conducted the mandatory roll call. 2 names, Anderson and Wise, went unanswered. The procedure was repeated twice. At 4:45 p.m., the captain contacted the Nagasaki Coast Guard, reporting the disappearance of 2 foreign nationals in a restricted area. The first police units arrived on the island at 6 p.m. By this time, the sun had already set, and the long shadows cast by the half-ruined skyscrapers had turned the island into a dark trap. The operation was led by Lieutenant Tanaka. He had 30 officers at his disposal, equipped with powerful searchlights. They divided the accessible area into sectors, but the complexity of Gunkanjima's architecture made a quick search impossible. The island was riddled with a network of basements, tunnels, and passageways, most of which were in disrepair. At around 8 p.m., a police helicopter equipped with a thermal imager joined the search. The pilot reported numerous thermal anomalies, but they all turned out to be concrete heated during the day, which was slowly giving off heat. It was technically impossible to distinguish a human heat signature against the backdrop of the scorched ruins. The ground search team reached the building of the former Sova Cinema, located in the southern part of the residential area. There, among the debris of the roof and rubble, one of the officers found a plastic lens cap that matched the cameras the girls had. It was the only piece of evidence found that night. Over the next 2 weeks, the scale of the operation only grew. Dog handlers with dogs trained to search for living people were brought in to help with the search. The dogs confidently picked up the trail from the breach in the perimeter near the school and led the group through the courtyard of Block 30. But at the entrance to the basement of the Sova Cinema, the trail abruptly ended, as if the girls had vanished into thin air. Coast Guard divers searched the water along the protective wall, checking the theory that the tourists could have fallen from a height into the sea. The stormy weather that prevailed in the region on August 15th and 16th complicated the work. The underwater currents around Gunkanjima are extremely strong, and the bodies could have been carried miles into the open ocean in a matter of hours. However, no fragments of clothing or equipment were found in the water. On August 28, 2016, the official active phase of the search was suspended. The final investigation report suggested that it was an accident. Experts speculated that Betty and Donna, trying to get spectacular footage, entered one of the damaged buildings, where the floors collapsed, or fell into one of the numerous flooded mines, which were thousands of feet deep. Access to these mines was physically impossible for rescuers due to flooding by seawater and debris. The families of the missing girls received dry, official letters expressing sympathy. Their belongings, left at a hotel in Nagasaki, were sent to the United States. The case was classified as missing, and the investigation file was sent to the prefecture archives. The island was deserted again, leaving tourists and guides alone with concrete skeletons. However, one of the volunteers who participated in the search in the last few days mentioned a strange detail in a private conversation with a local newspaper reporter that was not included in the official report. While inspecting the perimeter near Block 65, he noticed that the heavy metal door of one of the technical rooms, which was marked on the old plans as a passageway, had been welded shut from the inside. Fresh traces of rust on the seams indicated that this had happened not 50 years ago, when the mine was closed, but much later. At the time, no one paid any attention to it, attributing it to maintenance work on the facility. But the volunteer was sure. No repair crew was working on the island in those days. And behind those doors, there was a silence that seemed louder than the sound of the waves. On October 12, 2019, Typhoon Hagibis struck the coast of Japan with a destructive force that meteorologists had not recorded in the last 60 years. Wind speeds reached 140 miles per hour, and waves crashing against the concrete armor of Gunkanjima Island spilled over the protective walls, flooding the lower levels of the dead city. When the storm subsided, the Nagasaki Prefecture administration was faced with the need for an urgent inspection. The island, already slowly dying under the pressure of time and salt, could become a deadly trap for future tourist groups. It was decided to send a special commission to assess the structural integrity of the main routes. On October 16th at 8:30 a.m., a boat carrying a group of engineers and builders docked at the dilapidated pier. The group was led by Takeshi Yamada, an experienced structural engineer who had devoted more than 20 years to studying the architecture of Gunkanjima. They had detailed plans of the underground passages drawn up back in the 1950s, powerful flashlights, and gas cutters in case they needed to clear debris. Their main target was Block 30, Japan's oldest reinforced concrete building, constructed in 1916. After the typhoon, there was a risk that the building's foundation could be washed away, threatening the collapse of the entire 7-story complex. The inspection began on the upper floors and moved downwards. At 11:15 a.m., the group descended to the ground floor. It was completely dark there, illuminated only by the beams of their headlamps. The air was heavy, saturated with moisture and the smell of rot brought by the storm. The engineers checked the load-bearing columns, tapping the concrete and noting new cracks. According to Takeshi's report, they moved along a corridor that was marked on old maps as a storage area for mining equipment. This part of the basement was considered a dead end and had not been inspected for at least 10 years. At 12:40 p.m., one of the workers, shining a light on the far corner of the corridor, noticed a strange discrepancy. Among the rusty pipes and peeling walls, a massive metal door stood out, leading to the former technical room of the pumping station. The door itself was old and covered with a layer of corrosion, but the fastenings looked out of place. The hinges were not simply screwed on, but welded with rough, uneven seams that had not yet accumulated the layer of rust characteristic of the entire island. Takeshi approached the object. What he saw made him stop the group. The door was locked from the outside. It was not a regular padlock, which one would expect to see on an abandoned warehouse. It was a massive ship's bolt, welded directly to the door leaf and frame. The metal of the bolt looked much newer than its surroundings, and the welds were relatively fresh, no more than 3 or 4 years old. This could not have been the work of miners half a century ago. It was the work of someone who wanted to ensure that what was inside never came out. Assuming that the room was being used by smugglers as a hiding place, the engineer ordered the door to be opened. At 1:10, the worker lit the blowtorch. The blue flame cut into the metal, scattering sparks in the darkness of the basement. The process took almost 20 minutes. The smell of hot iron mixed with the musty air of the basement. When the last loop was cut, 2 men pried the heavy door open with crowbars. The metal gave way with a loud, drawn-out screech that echoed through the empty corridors. The door opened only a foot, stuck in its warped frame. And in that same second, a sound burst out of the darkness of the crack, causing the experienced builders to recoil. It was not the sound of the wind or the creaking of metal. It was a piercing, animalistic scream, filled with pure, concentrated horror. The sound was so loud and unnatural that Takeshi later compared it to the cry of a wounded animal cornered. The light from 5 powerful flashlights simultaneously hit the opening. The beams revealed a small, low-ceilinged chamber. The floor was covered with a layer of rubbish. Hundreds of empty plastic containers, dirty rags, bottles of yellowish liquid. In the far corner, huddled in a pile of rotten rags, sat a creature that only vaguely resembled a human being. It was a woman. She was exhausted to the extreme, her skin, pale as paper, stretched over sharp cheekbones and ribs, her limbs resembling dry branches. Her hair was matted into a single dirty clump that fell to her shoulders. It was Donna Wise, a woman who had been presumed dead for 3 years. But instead of relief, the appearance of people caused her to have an uncontrollable hysterical fit. She covered her eyes with her hands, trying to hide from the light, and began to bang her back against the wall. Words in English burst from her throat, which the workers did not immediately understand because of her erratic screaming. Takeshi, who knew a little English, tried to calm her down by stepping forward. It was a mistake. Donna screamed even louder, pointing her bony finger at the open door. According to witnesses, her scream was a plea for death, but not the death they imagined. "No, don't let me out!" she screamed, scratching the concrete floor with her fingernails. "Close the door! Close the door immediately! He said the air is poisoned. You'll kill us all! Don't let me out! I'll die!" She was breathing raggedly, gasping for air as if each breath caused her physical pain. Her eyes, wide with terror, showed her absolute belief that only death existed beyond the threshold of this cell. She did not recognize the people. She saw them only as harbingers of the apocalypse. The workers stood frozen in shock. But the most frightening thing was that the beam of the flashlight, which searched every corner of the cramped cell, revealed only one person. Amidst the piles of rubbish and stench, in this concrete vault where time had stopped 3 years ago, Betty Anderson was not there. Only an empty corner and the crazed gaze of a woman who was convinced that the outside world had long since burned to the ground. Friends, before we continue to delve into this creepy story, I want to ask you for a small but important favor. Please subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, like this video, and leave any comments. Your activity is the only way to signal to YouTube's algorithms that this content is worth paying attention to. It is thanks to your actions that this video will be able to get into the recommendations, and as many people as possible will see this story. Thank you all for your support. On October 16, 2019, at 2:15 p.m., a medical service helicopter landed on the roof of Nagasaki Prefectural Central Hospital. Donna Wise's evacuation was conducted under strict secrecy and biological isolation, not because of the threat of the virus, but because of the patient's own demands. The woman was hysterical when they tried to take her out of the airtight chamber into the fresh air. To transport her, paramedics had to administer a strong dose of sedatives. The initial examination in the intensive care unit shocked even experienced doctors. The medical record compiled that day recorded the patient's weight as 38 kilograms. She was in a state of extreme exhaustion. The woman's muscles had atrophied to such an extent that she could not stand on her own or even hold a cup of water. Her skin was almost transparent, covered with sores from constant exposure to dampness and a complete lack of sunlight for 3 years. Blood tests showed a critical deficiency of vitamin D and calcium, which made her bones as fragile as glass. But the physical trauma was nothing compared to what had happened to her mind. When the sedatives wore off, Donna woke up in a sterile ward with a large window through which the sun was setting. Her reaction was immediate and terrifying. She ripped off her IVs, hid in the darkest corner under the bed, and began screaming frantically, covering her face with her hands. She demanded that the staff immediately cover the windows with black film and put on chemical protection suits. Psychiatrists, who were urgently called to the ward, diagnosed the patient with severe paranoid disorder induced by prolonged isolation and psychological pressure. Nagasaki police investigators, who attempted to conduct their first interrogation on October 18th, were met with an impenetrable wall of madness. Donna Wise was absolutely convinced that the world she knew had ceased to exist in August 2016. From her confused, disjointed stories recorded on a tape recorder, the detectives began to piece together a picture of what had happened in the basement. Donna claimed that shortly after their arrival on the island, World War III had begun. She spoke of mushroom clouds on the horizon and a global epidemic that instantly killed all living things. The air on the surface, she said, had become a deadly poison that corroded the lungs and skin in a matter of minutes. In this distorted reality, her jailer was not an executioner, but a savior. She referred to him exclusively as the keeper. According to her, this man found them when the apocalypse began and managed to hide them in the only safe place, a sealed chamber underground. Donna recounted how the keeper risked his own life by going out onto the poisoned surface in a protective suit to find clean food for her. He brought her canned fish, rice, and water in sealed bottles, claiming that these were humanity's last reserves. Investigators were horrified to realize the criminal's methods. He didn't just lock the woman up in four walls. Day after day, he methodically broke her psyche, creating an alternate reality for her where he was a god and the only source of life. He fed her fear, describing in detail how people outside were dying in terrible agony, how their skin was peeling off their bones, and how cities were turning to ash. Donna believed his every word, because it was the only information she had received during 1,000 days of darkness. On October 19th, the detective tried to gently bring her back to reality. He showed her a newspaper with the current date and photos of modern Nagasaki, full of life. Donna pushed the photos away, calling them fake and a loyalty test set up by the Guardian. She begged them not to open the ward doors, convincing the doctors that they were already infected but didn't know it yet. However, the most important question remained: the fate of Betty Anderson. The police knew that only one woman had been found in the cell. When the investigator lowered his voice and asked, "Donna, where is Betty now? Was she in the room with you?" The patient suddenly fell silent. Her trembling stopped, and her gaze became glassy, staring into space. She began to rock back and forth, wrapping her arms around her shoulders as if trying to keep warm. Tears rolled silently down her sunken cheeks. "She didn't listen," Donna whispered in a voice devoid of emotion. "She was disobedient. The keeper warned us. He told us not to go near the exit. But Betty, she wanted to look." Donna looked up at the detective, her eyes filled with a primal horror that could not be feigned. "She went outside on the first day," she continued, her voice breaking into a whisper. "She opened the door, and the poison took her. I could hear it through the metal. I heard her scream. She screamed for so long. And then she just melted." The keeper said all that was left of her was a puddle on the concrete. Donna's words hung in the silence of the hospital room. The detectives exchanged glances. They understood that the story about melting was part of a delusion inspired by the criminal. But the scream the woman mentioned was real. Betty Anderson had indeed died that day, and Donna had witnessed it, even though her mind refused to accept the truth. Now the police had to return to the island and find what was left of the second girl, relying on the victim's chilling testimony about the first day. And what they were about to find could be much more terrifying than any imaginary radiation. On October 20th, 2019, at 7 in the morning, a group of Nagasaki prefectural police detectives once again stepped onto the concrete pier at Gunkanjima. This time, their goal was not rescue, but hunting. They were looking for traces of a ghost, a man who had been secretly visiting the closed island for 3 years, turning it into his private prison. The basement of Block 30, where Donna Wise was found, was cordoned off with yellow tape. Now this place was officially called the Zero-Level Chamber. The work of the experts inside the chamber resembled an archaeological excavation in hell. Every square inch of space was photographed and scanned with ultraviolet light. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention during a detailed examination of the walls was a chaotic network of scratches on the damp plaster near the place where the victim had slept. It was a calendar. Hundreds, thousands of vertical lines grouped in fives. Criminalist Tanaka, who kept the inspection report, counted 1,162 marks. The last line was unfinished. Donna counted every day of her hell, scratching out the time with a piece of a rusty nail found on the floor. But the true portrait of the criminal began to emerge when experts began analyzing the trash. 3 years of isolation left behind mountains of material evidence. Among the plastic bottles and dirty rags, the detective found a stack of old newspapers. They were issues of the local newspaper, Nagasaki Shimbun, dated various months of 2017 and 2018. However, each newspaper had the same feature. The upper right corner of the first page, where the date is usually printed, had been neatly cut out with scissors. This discovery made the investigators shudder. It was not carelessness. It was cold-blooded, deliberate cruelty. The kidnapper brought Donnie news from the outside world so she could read, but deprived her of the most important thing, a reference point in time. He maintained the illusion of the end of the world by showing her articles about local disasters or crimes, but hiding any mention of normal life, dates, or events that could disprove his apocalypse legend. This indicated that the criminal derived sadistic pleasure from controlling his victim's mind. The next step was to analyze the food waste. All the plastic water bottles were of the same brand, Kyushu Springs. It was cheap local water that was not exported outside the region. Investigators checked the serial numbers of the batches indicated on the labels. The result was surprisingly accurate. These batches of water were supplied exclusively to vending machines located along the southern coast of the Nagasaki Peninsula, in sparsely populated fishing villages. The situation with canned food was even more interesting. Most of the cans did not have commercial labels, only stamped markings on the lid. A request to the Fishermen's Association revealed that these were specific dry rations issued to crews on long voyages on industrial fishing vessels. Such canned food was not sold in supermarkets. This narrowed the circle of suspects to people who had access to maritime supplies or worked in port logistics. On October 22nd, the investigation team contacted the Coast Guard archives. They requested radar surveillance data for the waters around Gunkanjima for the period from August 2016 to October 2019. Analysts looked for anomalies, small vessels approaching the island at night or early in the morning, ignoring the restricted area. Computer analysis revealed a pattern. The same signal appeared on radar approximately once every 4 days. It was a small object, moving without a transponder. It left a small bay near the village of Nomozaki, approached the shady side of the island, where surveillance cameras had been damaged by storms 10 years ago, stayed there for 30 to 40 minutes, and returned. The route was always the same. The police compared the time the object went out to sea with data from video cameras on the roads leading to the port of Nomozaki. In the recordings made at dawn, an old pickup truck loaded with fishing nets often flashed by. The vehicle's license plate led investigators to the owner's name. It was 55-year-old Kenji Ogawa. The file on Kenji Ogawa, which landed on the desk of the head of the investigation team on October 23rd, fit perfectly into the psychological profile of the Keeper. Ogawa was a former skilled electrician and welder who had worked in the docks of Nagasaki Port for over 20 years. He had the skills and equipment to professionally weld the basement door and install a complex bolt. In 2014, he was fired amid scandal after a series of attacks on colleagues and complaints of inappropriate behavior. Witnesses described him as a recluse, prone to outbursts of unmotivated aggression and paranoid statements about a corrupt society. After his dismissal, he moved to his old family home in Nomozaki, on the very edge of the Cape, from where, on a clear day, you could see the silhouette of Gunkanjima. Neighbors said he rarely left the house during the day and often went out to sea at night in his old motorboat. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when detectives checked Ogawa's bank transactions. Despite not having an official job, he regularly bought large quantities of water and rice at a local wholesale store, paying in cash. The volume of purchases far exceeded the needs of a single person. On October 24th, at 6 p.m., a surveillance team took up positions around Ogawa's house in Nomozaki. The house looked neglected. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was littered with scrap metal. But deep inside the garage, a dim light was burning. The same pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and a boat swayed at the dock, ready to set sail. The police knew the suspect was inside. They had a name, they had a motive, and they had evidence. But they did not yet know whether the keeper was ready to surrender without a fight, and what other secrets, besides the cut-out dates in the newspapers, he was hiding behind the boarded-up windows of his lair. The capture operation was about to begin any minute. On October 20th, 2019, while the capture team on the mainland was preparing to storm the house in Nomozaki, another, no less grim drama was unfolding on Gunkanjima Island. The search team, led by Lieutenant Tanaka, was ordered to verify Donna Wise's testimony about the first day. Her words that her friend went outside and melted sounded like the ravings of a madwoman, but the investigators knew that there was a grain of truth in every delusion. Donna claimed she heard a scream very close by, behind the wall of her dungeon. Guided by the acoustics of the basements, the group headed to the neighboring sector. Their target was a building known as Niku Apartments, a former elite residential complex for mine management, located just 50 meters from Block 30. This 9-story building, constructed in the shape of the letter B, was considered one of the most dangerous on the island. Its central atrium had collapsed 5 years earlier, turning the staircase into a pile of concrete rubble. At 11:15 a.m., the group entered the half-flooded lobby. There was a deathly silence, broken only by the crunch of glass under their boots. Following the logic that the body should have been hidden and not left in an open place, Tanaka ordered the technical shafts to be searched. Their attention was drawn to the freight elevator shaft, whose doors had been broken down and lay inside the cabin, which was stuck between the first and basement floors. The beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness of the shaft, revealing a pile of debris at the bottom, about 15 feet down. Among the broken furniture and pieces of rusty rebar, something glinted unnaturally in the light. It was a camera lens. The descent took 40 minutes. When the forensic scientist reached the bottom, he confirmed the worst fears. Beneath a layer of dust and construction debris lay human remains. It wasn't the puddle Donna had shouted about. It was a skeleton, partially covered with the remains of synthetic clothing that hadn't rotted away in 3 years. A strap from a Sony Alpha camera hung around the victim's neck. Next to it lay a backpack, the color of which, despite the dirt, could be identified as bright blue. The same one Betty Anderson had on the day she disappeared. A rapid analysis conducted on site by a forensic expert who arrived at the scene dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. The victim's skull had suffered horrific damage. There was a huge crack in the back of her head from which smaller fractures radiated like a spider's web. It was not a fall from a height. The nature of the injury clearly indicated a blow from a heavy, blunt object from behind. Someone had crept up on the girl and struck her a fatal blow when she least expected it. At 1:30 p.m., while investigating the adjacent basement rooms of Nikki Apartments, detectives found something that became the key to understanding the motive. In a room that once served as a boiler room, an improvised warehouse was discovered. There, carefully covered with tarpaulin, were 8 boat motors of various brands. A check of the serial numbers showed that they had all been stolen from private boats in the port of Nagasaki between 2015 and 2016. Investigators instantly reconstructed the events of that fateful August day in 2016. Betty and Donna, looking for a way into Block 65, accidentally stumbled upon Kenji Ogawa's hideout. The island was not just his refuge, it was his criminal warehouse, the perfect place where no one would look. Ogawa was probably there at that moment, checking on his treasure. The encounter was sudden. Betty, who was walking first, saw the stolen goods. Ogawa, realizing that he had been exposed and that he faced prison for grand theft, acted instantly and brutally. He grabbed whatever was at hand. Experts later suggested it was a heavy wrench or a piece of pipe, and struck Betty on the head. Death was instantaneous. Donna, who was following behind, witnessed the murder. She was paralyzed with shock. Ogawa grabbed her, but instead of killing the second girl, his sick mind came up with another solution. He needed not only to get rid of the witness, but to destroy the very memory of the crime in her mind. He dragged her into a prepared chamber in a neighboring building. It was at this moment that the terrible lie about the poisoned air was born. Donna heard her friends scream and saw the blood, but her psyche, trying to protect itself from the unbearable truth, clung to Ogawa's explanation. He convinced her that Betty had not died by his hand, but by an invisible, deadly force from outside. She went outside and melted. This was a metaphor that Donna's broken mind turned into literal reality. Ogawa used her trauma to turn a witness for the prosecution into a grateful victim who saw him as a savior, not the murderer of her best friend. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Betty Anderson's body was brought to the surface. The island had claimed its second victim. But as the forensic team was packing up the evidence, one of the officers found a memory card from a camera in Betty's backpack. It was damaged by moisture, but the chip appeared to be intact. If the last shots taken minutes before her death were preserved on it, they could contain the killer's face or evidence of his presence. The officer handed the card to the team leader, but at that moment, the radio on his shoulder came to life. The dispatcher's voice from the mainland sounded alarmed. The surveillance team outside Ogawa's house reported movement. The garage door slowly opened. But instead of a pickup truck, something else stared at the police from the darkness. On October 24, 2019, at 6:45 p.m., a task force led by Inspector Sato took up positions around Kenji Ogawa's house in the village of Nomozaki. The place looked like the set of a movie about the end of the world, which the criminal had so diligently painted in his victim's imagination. The one-story wooden structure was buried in piles of rubbish. Rusty car engines, old refrigerators, coils of wire, and rotten fishing nets created a veritable maze around the house. The windows were boarded up with plywood, and barbed wire was strung around the perimeter of the fence, indicating the owner's paranoid desire to isolate himself from the outside world. Neighbors interviewed, whose testimony was included in the case file, described Ogawa as a night ghost. An elderly woman who lived across the street told investigators that she had never seen him in daylight in the last 3 years. "He only came out when everyone was asleep," she said. "I heard the rumble of his old motor at 2 or 3 in the morning. He would return at sunrise dragging some bags and disappear back into his hole. We were afraid of him. His eyes were glassy, like a dead fish. At 7:15 a.m., after waiting for any movement inside, the group received the order to storm the building. The soldiers broke down the front door, but were met only by silence and the unbearable stench of mold. The house was empty. The garage, where, according to surveillance, a pickup truck was supposed to be parked, was empty. But the most disturbing discovery was the back door leading to a private wooden pier. The chain that usually secured the boat had been cut with hydraulic shears, and the boat itself was gone. On the kitchen table, police found a radio tuned to the news. The announcer reported on the miraculous rescue of an American tourist on Gunkanjima Island. Ogawa knew. He heard the news, realized that his perfect world had been destroyed, and decided to act. The only question was what he planned to do: escape or destroy the evidence. At 7:40 p.m., the interception plan was announced. The Nagasaki Prefecture Coast Guard scrambled 2 Asagiri-class high-speed patrol boats. The search radius was expanded to 20 nautical miles. The weather that night worked against the fugitive. Waves up to 4 feet high were rolling in, and visibility through the fog was no more than 200 yards. At 9:15 p.m., the radar operator aboard the Asagiri 5 detected a weak signal. The small vessel was moving westward, toward the open sea, with its navigation lights off. It would have been suicide for an ordinary fisherman in such weather, but not for someone who knew these waters like the back of his hand. The object was 15 miles from shore. The Coast Guard boat caught up with the fugitive at 9:45 a.m. A powerful searchlight cut through the darkness, revealing an old, peeling motorboat. At the helm was Kenji Ogawa. He was dressed in a canvas raincoat, and his face, illuminated by the cold light, showed no fear, only rage. When ordered to turn off the engine, Ogawa responded with a sharp maneuver, trying to ram the side of the patrol boat. When this attempt failed, he grabbed a long harpoon used for hunting tuna. "Don't come any closer," he shouted, his voice drowning out the roar of the engines. "You don't understand. I cleaned this place up. I won't let you ruin everything." The standoff lasted less than 5 minutes. Coast Guard Special Forces used high-pressure water cannons to knock the criminal off his feet. Ogawa slipped on the wet deck, dropped the harpoon, and was instantly neutralized by the capture team that boarded his boat. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. During a search of the boat, investigators realized that Ogawa had no intention of dying. In the hold, they found enough fuel for 100 miles, a map with a route to uninhabited islands near Okinawa, and a large sum of cash sealed in plastic. But other findings told a much more frightening story. In the bow of the boat lay a stack of fresh newspapers from the past week. All the dates were correct. This was direct evidence that Ogawa was well aware of reality. He knew that the world had not ended, that war had not broken out, and that the air was clean. He read about politics, sports, and the weather before going down to the basement and telling Donna about radiation and mutants. Each newspaper was proof of his deliberate sadism. Next to the newspapers was a box of food: fresh apples, bread, high-quality chocolate. Things he never gave his captive, keeping her on a diet of fish scraps. But the most horrific discovery awaited the police in a black waterproof bag that Ogawa had tried to throw overboard just before his arrest. Inside was an old digital camera and a stack of printed photos. When the officer shone his flashlight on them, his hand involuntarily trembled. They were pictures of Donna. Hundreds of photos. But they were all taken from the same angle, through a round peephole or some hidden crack. The photos captured everything. Donna crying, curled up in a ball, her staring at the door in horror, her eating rice with dirty hands, her scratching at the wall. On the back of each photo, dates and times were written in neat handwriting, along with short comments. Day 142. Subject shows humility. Day 315. Attempt at prayer. Day 820. Complete acceptance. Ogawa didn't just hold her. He watched. He chronicled the destruction of a human personality, enjoying every stage of her decline, like a scientist enjoying an experiment on a lab rat. He was there, behind the door, almost every day, breathing the same air, listening to her cries and recording her pain on camera. When Ogawa was transferred to the patrol boat, he suddenly stopped resisting. He looked at the officer holding the bag of photographs, and a faint, eerie smile appeared on his face. "Do you think you saved her?" he asked quietly, looking straight into the policeman's eyes. "You only took her shell. Her mind is still there, in the darkness, with me. She will never truly leave that room." The boat turned around and headed for the shore at full speed, cutting through the black waves. Behind them, in the darkness of the sea, was an empty boat filled with evidence of madness. And ahead of them was the port, where the news of the found photographs would turn the kidnapping case into something much more terrifying. Inspector Sato did not yet know that there was another piece of evidence in Ogawa's coat pocket, the key to a bank deposit box, the contents of which would make even experienced psychiatrists shudder. On October 25, 2019, at 9 a.m., an interrogation began at the Nagasaki Prefectural Police Headquarters that would later be included in criminal psychology textbooks as an example of absolute, cold-blooded deviance. Kenji Ogawa, the man who had kept a woman in a concrete vault for 3 years and convinced her that humanity was doomed, sat at a metal table in interrogation room number 1. His wrists were handcuffed to the tabletop, but his posture expressed not remorse or fear, but relaxed confidence. He looked like a teacher who had come to a parent-teacher conference, not a murderer caught in the act. Inspector Sato, who conducted the interrogation, later admitted that what struck him most was not the cruelty of the facts, but the tone of the suspect. Ogawa spoke quietly and deliberately, using complex grammatical constructions and polite forms of address. When he was charged with the kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment of Donna Wise, he calmly shook his head, as if correcting the mistake of a careless student. "You are using the wrong terminology, Inspector." The audio recording captured his words. "Kidnapping implies harm. I performed an act of rescue. I removed her from an environment that was destroying her and placed her in a sterile incubator." When asked what exactly he had rescued her from, Ogawa delivered a monologue that revealed the depths of his worldview. He claimed that the modern world was rotten to the core, that people lived in a cesspool of lies and sin. "I created a pure world for her," he said, looking straight into the surveillance camera. "There, in that room, there was no politics, no wars, no betrayal. There was only the truth that I gave her. She was grateful to me. Did you see her eyes in the photos? That's not fear. That's reverence. She loved me for taking on the burden of responsibility for her life." But the real horror came when the investigators brought up Betty Anderson. The inspector placed a photograph of the skull found in the elevator shaft on the table and asked if Ogawa would admit his guilt in the murder. The suspect didn't even blink. He looked at the photograph as if it were a technical drawing. "It was a necessary sanitary measure," he replied without emotion. Subject number 2, Betty. She was infected with disobedience. She refused to accept the new rules of reality. She tried to destroy the integrity of our world, I did not kill her in the sense that you mean the word. I simply eliminated the threat of infection, like a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. He described the moment of impact with the wrench as if he were fixing a leaky pipe. There was no regret or sadistic pleasure in his voice, only cold, mechanical expediency. To him, Betty was not a human being, but an error in an equation that he had corrected. Throughout November 2019, Kenji Ogawa underwent a comprehensive inpatient forensic psychiatric evaluation. A group of 5 leading Japanese psychiatrists attempted to answer the question, was he insane in the legal sense? Ogawa exhibited classic signs of God complex. He sincerely believed himself to be a superior being who had the right to dispose of the fates of inferior people. His delusional ideas about a rotten world were persistent and uncorrectable. However, despite the presence of delusional disorder, the commission came to a unanimous and frightening conclusion. Kenji Ogawa was sane. He was able to control his actions and was fully aware of their danger to society. His behavior outside the bunker was proof of this. Psychiatrists pointed to the careful planning of the crime. Ogawa did not believe in a nuclear winter or poisoned air. He read newspapers, watched television, voted in elections, and paid taxes. He created the myth of the apocalypse exclusively for Donna as a means of control. He cut out dates from newspapers not because he himself was lost in time, but to disorient his victim. His logistics were flawless. He only went out to sea on moonless nights, studied the Coast Guard patrol schedule down to the minute, bought groceries at different stores so as not to arouse suspicion, and used cash so as not to leave any digital traces. These are not the actions of a madman who has lost touch with reality, Dr. Ishiguro noted in his final report. These are the actions of a predator who built a cage and enjoyed power over his prey. His madness is not a brain disease, it is a moral abyss. He knew he was doing evil, but he renamed it as good to satisfy his ego. On December 6, 2019, the Nagasaki Public Prosecutor's Office officially filed charges. Ogawa accepted the news of the trial with surprising enthusiasm. While in pretrial detention, he began writing numerous complaints, not about the conditions of his detention, but about the fact that he was not being given paper to write his manifesto. He wanted to appear before the court not to justify himself, but to explain his philosophy to the world. When the investigator last visited him before the case was sent to court, Ogawa handed him a small piece of paper rolled into a tube, torn from his lawyer's notebook. "You think you've isolated me," he said with the same eerie smile. "But you're wrong. I'm not in prison. I've just moved to another room. And Donna? She's still with me. Ask her when she falls asleep whose voice she hears in the silence." The inspector left the cell with a heavy feeling that the upcoming trial would not be just a legal procedure, but the stage for the final act of a play, the script for which Ogawa had been writing for 3 years in the darkness of the basement. And the scariest thing was that the evidence, which was yet to be revealed to the jury, contained a detail that would shock even those who thought they had seen it all. On January 15, 2020, the Nagasaki District Court building found itself at the center of global attention. Hundreds of reporters from Japan, the United States, and Europe surrounded the perimeter, trying to get at least one shot of the man the press had dubbed the architect of hell. The trial of Kenji Ogawa was unprecedented both in the cruelty of the details revealed and in the depth of psychological horror into which he plunged his victims. The courtroom was packed, but when the guards brought in the defendant, silence fell. Ogawa looked calm, even indifferent, holding a folder of papers in his hands, as if he had come to a scientific conference rather than to receive his sentence. The key moment of the trial was the testimony of Donna Wise. The victim was unable to be physically present in Japan. Doctors at a specialized clinic in Sacramento, California, categorically prohibited her transportation, citing the patient's fragile mental state. The testimony was given via secure video link. When her face appeared on the big screen in the courtroom, many of those present looked away. Donna sat in a room with soft walls, dressed in gray hospital clothes. She asked the operators to adjust the camera so that the door would not be in the frame. Even the image of the exit caused her to have panic attacks. Her voice was quiet and monotonous, but each word hit the jury harder than any physical evidence. She spoke not of physical pain, but of the fear that had become her only reality. "He didn't hit me," she said, staring past the camera. "He just turned off the lights and turned on the sounds. I heard air raid sirens. I heard explosions. I heard people screaming for water. I believed I was the last person on earth, and he was my God. I thanked him for rotten fish because I thought it was a gift." The climax of the prosecution's case came with the presentation of the key piece of evidence found in Ogawa's bank vault. Prosecutor Takeda put on white gloves and raised a thick notebook with a black leather cover above his head. It was not just a diary. It was the Laboratory Journal of the New World, as the defendant himself called it. In 300 pages, Ogawa meticulously, with the precision of an engineer, described his experiments on the captive's psyche. The prosecutor read several excerpts, which were met with dead silence in the courtroom. Entry from February 12, 2017. The subject shows signs of doubt. Red alert protocol initiated. Used external speakers to simulate artillery fire. The subject hid under the bed and refused food for 3 days. Effectiveness confirmed. Entry dated July 5, 2018. Changed diet. Reduced water intake to 500 milliliters. Subject began calling me father. Attachment intensifies due to dependency. These entries proved that Ogawa's actions were not spontaneous madness. It was cold-blooded torture, planned for years, where every one of Donna's hysterics, every one of her tears, was pre-written in the executioner's script. He wasn't saving her from an imaginary apocalypse. He was creating that apocalypse personally for her, using powerful audio systems and staged lighting effects installed in the ventilation shafts. On March 3, 2020, Judge Ito read out the verdict. Given the severity of the crimes, the prosecution sought the death penalty by hanging. However, the defense reached an agreement with the investigation. In exchange for full disclosure of the details of Betty Anderson's murder and the location of the murder weapon, which divers found at the bottom of a flooded mine, Ogawa was guaranteed his life. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and first-degree murder. Kenji Ogawa was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, the defendant merely adjusted his glasses and smiled slightly as he looked at the screen, where the broadcast from America had already been turned off. He was led out of the courtroom under heavy guard, and the doors of the maximum security prison in Osaka closed behind him forever, becoming his own, this time real, bunker. Epilogue. Today, Gunkanjima Island looks the same as it did 100 years ago, gray, majestic, and dead. From a bird's-eye view, where our film crew's drone rises, the concrete wells of the houses resemble empty beehives. Tourist routes are open again, but the rules have changed. Now each group is accompanied by 2 guides, and the perimeter is patrolled by drones with thermal imaging cameras. The story of Betty and Donna has changed this place forever. The entrances to the basements of Block 30 and Block 65 have been welded shut with thick steel plates by order of the prefectural government. Now it is impossible to get in, and the darkness inside forever preserves the echoes of screams that no one heard in time. This metal has become a scar on the island's body, a reminder that even the most abandoned places on Earth can hide evil that is very real and has a human face. Donna Wise was never able to fully return to the life that was stolen from her. She founded the charity Voice from Silence, which helps victims of prolonged abduction and psychological abuse. The foundation funds rehabilitation for those who have survived such hell. However, Donna herself remains a prisoner of her memories. She lives in a house with panoramic windows, but never goes outside without 2 bodyguards. She still checks the dates on newspapers 3 times and flinches when she hears the sound of an ambulance siren. For her, the island has not disappeared. It has simply moved inside her head. And this imprisonment has no statute of limitations. The story on Gunkanjima has ended, but the question it left behind remains open. How many more locked doors and secret rooms are scattered around the world? And whose voices are crying out for help right now, in the silence that we mistakenly consider to be peace?